Hey, here with Peter from Paleologos, an enigma to me. So you
Hi
want to
there.
you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your channel, your hopes and dreams, your goals?
Certainly, yeah. So thank you for having me on here. It's great to talk with you. Yeah, so my name is Peter, and I run a small YouTube channel called Paleologos, and I love to research hominins and fossils are kind of my interest, especially basically human origins. And I'm a young Earth creationist, and so I believe in God creating the Earth about 6,000 years ago, literal Adam and Eve. So a lot of my interest is in exactly how we can form a biblical model, right? Because we can attack evolution, and I think that is pretty important, but we also need to have some sort of replacement, right? So kind of attacking evolution and building our own model go hand in hand. So I'm interested in answering questions like what did the first humans look like and how exactly can we model how populations have changed through time, and does that match what we find in the biblical record? And so that's kind of my area of interest.
And that's why you're an enigma to me because I listen to some of your critiques of some of the creationist science that's really bad, and you're obviously brilliant and well, educated, and way too young to be as educated as you are. You're like the other side's rational empiricist, Andrew Cumming. I mean,
Oh, sure. I
yeah, he's
agree.
brilliant, and every now and then he teaches us a bunch of new tricks. And he's like 19, so I was confused why anybody who can think well and do science well would believe in 6,000 years for the Earth, and that's it. That's the enigma. That's the confusion. Like, how could you ever come up with 6,000 years? So it has to be from the Bible first, right? And then, because there are no papers or geology or anything that leads science to believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old. You, do you admit
I
that?
I think there are some indications from the natural world that the world is younger than millions of years, but I don't know necessarily that we have a specific, process that we could point to and pin it down to 6,000 years. So you were right that I believe in the Bible, and thus I think it is accurately recording the history of the earth.
Okay. So when you talk about coming up with a model, um, that would be that I would like to talk about a little bit later. But then
Hmm.
on Cell's channel last night, I saw this message from you, and I was so amazed. And Cell, could this be linked to their claims about inheritance? Even they must agree that at some point genetic information is not inherited from an ancestor. The science of inheritance failed somewhere. So why would you say that?
Well, we were kind of talking about kind of boundaries of science, and I don't know. I was just kind of tossing up a random idea I had at the time, and
Okay,
my thought was basically that at some point, your genetic information doesn't go back to an earlier ancestor, right?
okay,
Because you had to have some sort of first life that had some sort of genomic code, right?
right.
That had to have just come together. And my point was that your side as well has to believe that at some point, this genetic information doesn't come from an ancestor, and you are placing that at a different level than we are. So we're saying, right, that there's a created kind that was created, and the kind doesn't have any ancestors before their creation. And you're saying that basically this first life was right, didn't have any information from any ancestors.
Okay. Well, we believe that information was laid down like tracks along the way. Basically, the information started out as a much simpler system with
Hmm.
with much smaller and more diverse biomolecules, and then it went to a stage of somewhere where the idea of a cell would settle down, and so that's one of the things we're looking for, and so now you have cells, but in these cells, there are, something like, well, there's 10 to, I think 10 to the 50. I read somewhere 10 to the 50th prokaryotes on the surface of the ocean today.
Wow.
Okay. Now, so there may have been 10 to the 50th prokaryotes. And if there were, I think there were 10 to the 48th different species of cells. So they're all different, right? They all have different packages. And at that stage, they were interchanging information, back and forth. They were eating each other. They were ingesting each other in a symbiotic manner. They were budding off. They were splitting, so there was this great mixing. So you end up with a big bush at the bottom, like a big, huge bush that's branching out. And then it starts to coalesce, and then it forms a few smaller branches, and they all come up. But I don't believe that there was like one eukaryotic cell that got lucky and turned into eukaryotes. I don't believe that at all. I believe it was more bush-like. So anyway, but along the way, DNA went from being simple RNAs. Okay,
Right.
simple RNAs.
So you would hold the RNA to DNA view.
Yeah, well, it has to be. I mean, there's. I mean, if you look at the ribosome, the core is RNA. If you look at what's going on in the nucleus, the core is RNA. The whole thing behind translation and everything is all core RNA. So DNA is sort of a newfangled convenience that the new kids on the block came up with a long time after everything else started, right? So RNA peptide world is one of the stages that I believe in, but prior to that, I'm pretty open about it. But yeah, that sort of thing. So anyway, so the idea is that you had all of these small peptides that started to reproduce from a template. So that's where the information started.
Mm-hmm.
And then by just the sheer huge, large numbers and natural selection, it put together a path through a network, right? So it's a path through a network to life, to the life that we know today. And what we know today is highly crystallized and condensed and settled down compared to what it was back then. So we're trying to find, what we're trying to do in abiogenesis is we're trying to find as many of those pathways as we can. And to do that, okay, a pathway, right, is like you understand a network graph, right? Like a digraph.
Yep.
Okay. So you got two nodes, right? You got an edge between them. So we got billions and billions of nodes. And what we do in abiogenesis, we try to figure out one of those edges, one probable, possible edge to go from one place to another. And then some other researcher finds another edge and another edge and another edge. And 50 to 100 years from now, we'll start putting a few of these things together and say, well, that would have worked. This other one would have worked, and that would have worked. But we don't know what really happened. We're never going to know that.
I don't have as much trust in abiogenesis as you do, but...
Yeah, well, I've looked into it at a pretty serious molecular level, and I have a lot of trust. So,
okay. Well,
anyway, so
great to hear that you've studied that.
So, okay, 6,000 years. Why? Why, Peter? Why die on that hill? What is that?
Well, as to why it's important, I think it's important because it is fairly fundamental to the Bible. And I also think that there are some scientific facts that are fairly consistent with it. So, as in the Bible, I think that the Bible has a lot of kind of fundamental things that revolve around 6,000 years and having a literal Adam and Eve, especially in relation to sin and death, but also, the words of Jesus and various of the apostles. And so for me, having a young earth is kind of ingrained through the whole Bible. I can kind of see it. It's not just something that I would come up from a skewed reading of Genesis 1.
What if you're wrong about that, about the interpretation of the Bible? And it was and it was about something very, very deep, much deeper, and something else entirely. What if?
Well, I mean, we always have to be willing to accept the possibility that we're wrong. And, I could entertain that possibility, but ultimately I do think that I am right. And that is what the biblical author was trying to communicate.
Yeah. So, okay. So you have a model basically for how how life in the earth was created, that sort of thing. But and you have how do you fit Neanderthals in? Because you don't believe they were human, right?
I do. Yeah. So I have a little bit of a different view from other young earth creationists like Donnie and other people. Basically, a lot of young earth creationists want to emphasize that Neanderthals were human. And some of the time, what ends up happening is that they basically want to overlook all of the differences between humans in the past and humans today.
Okay.
And that's problematic, right? Because Neanderthals were very different from us, and things like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, right, are vastly different from us in a lot of different ways, skeletally speaking. And so the problem there is that creationists want to make this boundary, right? We believe that there is a distinction between humans and non-humans. And sometimes people go over the deep end in trying to just basically argue that all of the human fossils belong to Homo sapiens, which is just kind of crazy. It just, expanding the definition of what it means to be Homo sapiens. Not that it's super important to maintain like the concept of a certain species, because species don't really exist, but simply kind of ignoring the diversity of humans in the past as if, that never existed.
Right.
Well, clearly it did exist, because humans were much more diverse than in the past than they are in the present, right? And that's something that we have to account for in our models. We can't just assume that Homo sapiens is like the only thing that ever existed, or like Homo sapiens gave rise to these other groups, because phylogenetically speaking, Neanderthals are an outgroup to modern humans, right? So that means that we share a common ancestor with Neanderthals, not that our species gave rise to them. Which is why I have problems with like Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's work. So he has done the work with, for example, let's see, would it be the Y chromosome and kind of the mitochondrial DNA as well? And he's done the work, right? And Rob Carter has done some of this too as well, trying to make a tree, right? And then they'll put a midpoint root on it. And sometimes they would try to argue, right, that there's like 3 branches coming off, which represent the 3 sons of Noah. Now, I have problems with that, because obviously, if we would include, for example, Neanderthals in that, what happens? Well, it turns out that Neanderthals end up being an outgroup to all 3 sons of Noah, right? Which doesn't make very much sense, right?
Yeah.
So then, of course, they would want to argue that Neanderthal DNA is, is somehow contaminated or useless, and we can't use it. Well, I think that's a very bad argument to go down, because of the consistency of Neanderthal DNA, right, from multiple different sites, the fact that we can find their DNA in our own genomes, the fact that when we look at it phylogenetically, it forms a nice, neat clade. And when they sequence ancient genomes like this, they obviously do them very specifically to try to preserve them, right? Because they will actually run the test like multiple times, right, to try to make sure that they're getting the right sequence. And they kind of, especially to do that when they're doing ancient genomes like this. So I don't think there's reason to think that those genomes are somehow too degraded to actually work, right? So then we come to a model, right, where we have to think about much more diversity than just simply Homo sapiens, right? And ultimately then is kind of another place where I would differ with other young earth creationists in believing that Adam and Eve probably were not Homo sapiens in my model. And this is
what? Okay.
Yeah.
So,
well, the thing is, right, this is a holdover from species fixity, right? So species fixity, right, all the modern forms persist back to creation. Well, how did we get over species fixity? Well, we looked at the fossil record and we used genomics, and we realized that organisms have all changed through time, right? So almost none of the modern forms in the world, go all the way back.
right.
And I think the same thing is with humans, right? So before we had discovered Neanderthals or these other types of humans, right, people just assumed species fixate. Well, Adam and Eve must have looked just like us. Well, now we have all these other types of humans, and I think it's fairly obvious from the fossil record that our own species, Homo sapiens, peters out fairly quickly in the fossil record. So for me, in my model building, I think that it is incorrect to assume that Adam and Eve or even Noah would have been Homo sapiens. So that's another place where I would kind of differ with other younger creationists.
Okay, so you move back a little bit. So okay, but now do you believe that at the root of that tree there were two people, Adam and Eve? So you believe they all came from that, and you understand the problems with genetic diversity today.
So right, I mean, there's been people who have attempted to answer that question in different ways, and obviously there are those who would argue that created heterozygosity can explain that. Now, I'm not particularly confident in the created heterozygosity argument. So I'll say that.
What do you think happened?
What do I think happened?
What do you think?
Well, I think it's possible that certain groups may have hypermutated through time to produce some of the features that make them so distinct. I think that, well, I mean, we have to be kind of specific here, right, on exactly what group we're talking about.
Right.
So some of those factors may not apply to certain groups, right? So I wouldn't say that we could like apply one general thing necessarily to every group, right? So because there's different factors working on kind of each of these different human groups as they have diversified.
Yeah. So hypermutation is kind of problematic for me for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's mutation, and to hypermutate requires, like, mutation has to proceed very, very carefully, right? Mm-hmm. So like what's happening in us today, or in, let's pick a species, raccoons, right? So a raccoon has, a number of eggs, and they become fertilized, and most of those eggs don't ever live. They don't ever become actual embedded pregnancies, right, in the raccoon. And so all of the mutations that are problematic are pretty much purified right out from the start, right? And then they end up with a certain amount of mutations that are neutral that end up in the population, and those end up going from one population to a next, and they will fix or not fix depending on the size of the population and all of that, right? But if you had a hypermutation, the amount of problematic I do not like the word deleterious, but the amount of mutations that result in an unviable organism, would be very, very high.
Right, and this is where I think we have something interesting coming in from Neanderthals, because we have these places in the human genome that are basically Neanderthal deserts, right? So we can look throughout this whole region and we don't find anything that came from Neanderthals, any genomic, mistakes or anything that came from Neanderthals in that region, and it's called a desert. And interestingly, we have these on, obviously the mitochondrial genome, right? So our mitochondrial genome we don't share stuff with Neanderthals from that because basically somehow that was selected out. And then more recently, of course, they sequenced the Y chromosome of Neanderthals. And we also know that we don't share a ton of their Y chromosome, if I remember correctly, either. And then on the X chromosome, the genes that are expressed in the testes are also missing among modern humans. And so all of that actually points to very strong selective power against Neanderthal sequences, right? In modern humans, that we've lost all of those different parts.
Right.
And they've obviously been able to correlate a lot of Neanderthal genes to the cause of specific diseases. Now, whether or not that would have actually caused those diseases in Neanderthals, I think is another question, right? Because in work in Homo sapiens that could have a different effect, right, than it might have in the Neanderthal genome.
Yeah,
because of
Neanderthals
the differences.
compensating.
Right. But I
Compensating
think those are some evidences that it could be that Neanderthals rapidly diversified, and then as a result of that, they had some very deleterious mutations, and then they had to be basically subsumed into the Homo sapiens population.
Okay. I think
Now, there are some things there, though, that Neanderthals are highly inbred, right? And
yeah,
the problem
Homo
there,
sapiens.
right. And the problem there is that we only have the Neanderthals from very late in the fossil record, right? Because that's all the genomes that we've been able to sequence, right? So Neanderthal fossils go way back further than the genomes we've been able to sequence. And so the question there is, were Neanderthals always inbred? Or, was there actually a larger population that became inbred over time? That's a kind of important question also for considering that.
But you admit that this idea of hypermutation does not come from any genetic study. Rather, it comes from your idea of 6,000 years and goes downward. There's no indication that there was hypermutation in these lines and then it quit hypermutating that we can find.
I think there is evidence that mutations would occur at a faster rate in Neanderthals. So there was a genetic modeling study that did this, and basically their goal was that they looked and they had like a starting population of Neanderthals and a starting population of Homo sapiens, and basically given the same amount of time, Neanderthals would occur more deleterious mutations than Homo sapiens did.
Got reference for that? Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, something you give me.
Yes, that was the genetic effects of Neanderthal introgression. Was that the name of it? Now, part of that might be based on population size, however. Let me see. I'm trying to think of exactly what that was about.
I don't like humans or hominids or primates all that much, so I don't spend a lot of time on that. But I like going back further. So,
but the question here, right, is okay. So, is this diversity that happens to have happened, occurred over a very long period of time, or could this be something that happened rather shortly? And I think there is some importance there. You're right that we need some sort of way to distinguish, right, between whether this is something that happened over a long period of time to make the Neanderthals different, or if this is something that could happen over a short period of time. And exactly how you would distinguish between those just from the genetics, I'm not entirely certain. I think you're muted because I can't hear you.
how long have I been muted?
There you go. Now I can hear you.
Okay, so if we look at the phenotype of Neanderthals and humans, I would suggest that we could very rapidly go from one phenotype to another because it doesn't require a lot of genetic information to change to make those kind of phenotypic changes. But that isn't what we're seeing in the genome. We're seeing a lot of differences indicating a very long line of mutations on both branches. So that's a problem. But as far as going from one body plan to another, like the Cambrian explosion or something, it's not a problem in my head.
Well, I think you're right that it's not very hard to go from the common ancestor of Neanderthals and modern humans to both of those forms, because a lot of the differences have to do with like the size and attachment of muscles and basically strengthening the bones.
And that's easy, but what we can account for is the actual neutral genetic diversity between the two species, and that would require a hypermutation rate. So
that's quite, I think it may be.
So
obviously there are other creationists who would want to appeal to genetic or created heterozygosity, and obviously to a point I have to agree, but I don't think that created heterozygosity can just explain all of these different forms cropping up. I just don't think there's any way to actually support that.
Right. The problem with Donnie's model on that is, for Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve at most could have had 4 alleles. So if you have four alleles, that's what your limit is, with 2 people. And then of course you have from Noah's Ark, you have the possibility, I think, of 8, basically. There were 8 people in the Ark. 6,
Yes.
Six
But
breeding.
the problem is that 3 of them were sons of Noah, and Noah and his wife never reproduced after the flood.
Yeah, so there's a limited number of alleles, but
Certainly, yeah.
Standing thinks that somehow recombination changes that, and that just doesn't work. That model just flat out doesn't work with genetics at all. That recombination could never account for that kind of diversity in a particular allele. And besides that, even if it was a recombination, we could tell, because if like a gene split right in the middle, we'd know that the top, right, would match some other allele, and the bottom would match another, right? And that somehow magically, the magic bullet hit that little tiny exon right in the middle, which is like totally improbable. And then we would still be able to tell that it was a recombination event and not a mutation, that sort of thing. So his model totally falls down. So you don't have that. Another
It's
one.
possible that's correct, but yeah. So I think created heterozygosity is kind of problematic, and sometimes it's just kind of invoked to answer everything, which I feel is a little problematic. Yeah. It just can't explain every question. I mean, like sometimes like it's invoked to like explain, well, why are Neanderthals shorter than us? Or like, no, I don't think that explains things like that. I think Neanderthals adapted to their environment through mutations, and that is why they look the way they do, not because they just happen to feel their environment and express some genes. I think there were mutations that Neanderthals used to adapt.
Yeah, you can say something like created heterozygosity and imagine that it works. But if you pick one gene and you take that gene and you start doing sequence comparisons between those genes, well, that's where you have to make it work. You have to have a plausible solution to why the sequence is the way it is and not some other way. I just ran into that with ERVs with Donnie, where I took a particular small sign transposon, not an ERV, but a transposon, a non-LTR transposon. And I went through and started looking at the structure of it, right? And you can't, when you look at it at that level, it's very difficult to support most of the stuff that creationists do. Almost all of it. I've had it fail over and over and over again. And I'm like, okay, this isn't working, that isn't working. The only thing that's left for the creationists is to say, well, God did it that way. Sorry. God did it like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily have like a particular view on ERVs, so I'm kind of open. I don't know. I want to do more reading up on them before I kind of make kind of a decision or like go with a particular position. So I'm kind of open to multiple possible origins for ERVs at the moment.
They're great ways to basically look at molecular clocks. And they're very great ways to look at phylogenies because they are mostly neutral. They mostly have no effect. Their sequence has no effect. 99.9% of them have not been found to have any function. And they're in places that it would be very unlikely for them to have a function. So 99% of them are really pure little neutral sections of DNA that we can watch mutational clocks on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're very useful that way. So,
yeah. I was just looking for a paper on that the other day, constructing a primate phylogeny that they could do using mutational rates on ERVs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the paper that we were just talking about with I almost forgot what it is already. If you know the first author and the year, I could probably find it in my library.
Let's see.
Or I could at least look it up.
So they have some modeling in that thing that I don't necessarily agree with. So let's see. But I think, is this little paper here? I think it's The Genetic Cost of Neanderthal Introgression, and it's by Harris 2016 is the paper, if you want to check that out.
Harris. Okay. Let's see. Harris 2016, got it right here, I believe. Let's see.
So another...
I got the paper. I do have
Oh,
the
you did?
paper.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll take a look at that. And I'll make sure I link it in the description. I want to link as much in the description as we can.
So another kind of way in which I kind of have some different views than a lot of other young Earth creationists would also be in regards to the Australopithecines, right? So I think this has been kind of a major stumbling block for the creationist community. And there's so many conspiracy theories around this that have risen up that are just completely crazy, right? So there's the idea that Donald Johanson found Lucy's knee 2 miles away and in 600 feet deeper strata. And obviously it was just a completely different femur and tibia. And then there's the idea that Lucy was just strewn over this hillside when in fact she was actually found in 9 square meters. Or was it 3 square meters? I think it was 3 square meters actually, which I found pretty amazing actually, that it was in that small of an area. And also the idea that the Australopithecines, oh, well, either these are all just a jumble of different species that happen to be mixed up together, or, or they didn't walk upright at all. And those are all just, I find them very unconvincing. And one problem which I've seen is an inability or an unwillingness to deal with the better fossils, like Littlefoot. Like, how many years has it been since Littlefoot has been discovered, right? And we've heard so little about it from the people who are trying to advocate for this view, right?
Yep.
So, for example, Answers in Genesis, I mean, like, what is the one thing they can really appeal to, right? It's really the semicircular canals of the ears, which don't actually prevent Littlefoot from walking upright, right? They simply mean that he couldn't have, he wouldn't be good at jumping or at long distance running, is what I understand is the effect, right? And so I think that's very problematic how creationists have attempted to deal with the Australopithecines as if they were not walking upright, when in fact I think it's fairly obvious from the anatomy that they were. Right. And then that actually becomes something that we actually have to deal with rather than just dismissing away as irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah, it just seems like you guys, air quotes, are really trying to do a lot of stretching and turning and churning and trying to smash everything into this 6,000 years. Have you have you looked at like the kind of Christian that I really, really like? I like their ideas. Is the one that believes that, okay, God is like enigmatic, right? Very, very difficult for a human mind to wrap his mind around, right? That God is, for the most part, God is a mystery that created a universe, with the expansion, right? In just such a way that that our species would fall out, that this special species would fall out, that man would happen. And God knew that in advance, basically by the parameters of physics, the universe, chemistry, periodic chart, whatever. And from that, this population of man evolved from, primitive animals, right? Evolution is completely true. Abiogenesis, completely true. God knew exactly what he was doing when he started the expansion by placing the galaxies and the matter where they were, right? All the matter was placed specifically to make this happen. And then from that, a race of humans developed, and the original sin was the point where the humans developed the ability to rationalize their actions. And sin was created as a result of rationalizing our actions, right? Being able to say, oh, I got to go kill those people over there because they're screwing up the dump grounds, or they're screwing up the garbage dump, right? So we got to kill them, right? And so and he's got reasons for doing that. He's got a rationale, right? So that becomes sort of the original sin, and then from there, it was Jesus was an actual miracle that was given basically to man to kind of straighten this mess out, because even God didn't bother to engineer or design all of what man could do once that match of rationality lit. Once that apple was eaten, right, from the tree of knowledge, that God did not kind of wanted to be surprised or have a relationship with humanity, basically, rather than direct humanity to a result. So God directed everything up to when the match was lit, when the apple was eaten, right? And from there on, and therefore Jesus became a necessity. But Noah's flood, none of that stuff happened. All of that stuff indicates was a way to convey to man 2,000 years ago, and hopefully man thereafter, that here's the truth. Here's how I created this. Here's what I wanted, that sort of thing. So I mean, on that view, you don't have to deny any science. And you as a young man, I just hate to see you spend all this time trying to shoehorn really, really good information and your own brilliance into 6,000 years. Because you're going to be a problem for us in 20 years. We're going to have to cancel you, dude. We're going to have to.
Well, I mean, as nice of a story as that sounds, I
Yeah.
just really struggle to see how that actually fits the Bible.
Why?
Well, I think there's multiple problems with this view. I mean, first of all, I think the chronology of the order of the events in Genesis 1 would contradict that.
What if what if they're just sort of a way to tell a story, but not a way?
Well, you could just say that it's a way to tell a story, but the problem is that the young Earth isn't just, and kind of the ideas that are associated with that aren't just from Genesis 1, right? So even if you say, well, that's poetry, well, other biblical authors used those ideas, right? And they used them in a way which I believe, showed that they thought them to be accurate and not poetical.
Well, yeah, they believed them because they didn't really know any better back then. But what did they need to know about science? I mean, why was science even a problem? I mean, why this wasn't about science. This was about mankind and right and wrong. And
I mean, there were still kind of competing views of kind of the origin of nature. I mean, like obviously some of like the ancient Greeks and things like that would have thought that the Earth was very old. But
yeah,
I mean, that would have been a little later, I guess, than some of this. Well,
like to me, if I were a Christian, I would want that powerful, poetic God who was just so basically so omniscient that it could engineer this whole story, and that this story has mystery after mystery waiting for us to unravel and discover it in our own souls, right? And that's kind of spirituality. It's the idea of I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. Let me see where it turns me.
well, I don't think that God is portrayed, in the Bible is necessarily, against that. I mean, like I would agree with you when you were talking earlier about God in some sense being unknowable, because there is so much to him, and we can only know what he has revealed about himself, right? So I would kind of agree with that there is so much to understand and explore there that we can't even really understand. But as far as the young Earth, okay, so we could say, well, what was Paul or was Jesus wrong about, Adam and Eve, for example? Well, I think if you're going into there saying that Jesus was wrong about Adam and Eve, well, then you have some problems with the nature of God, right? If Jesus can be wrong about something like that, right? So,
Well, not necessarily wrong, just, going with the narrative, because Jesus would understand that, who he was dealing with at the time, 2,000 years ago. There weren't a lot of geneticists or
so basically, he's just lying to them to tell them what they want to hear.
telling the absolute truth, but in such a way that they could get to the point and not worry about the details and about the story and biology. And because Jesus didn't really give a shit at that point about biology, right? I mean,
Well, I
why would he
think,
care about molecular biology and getting the story right if he was just trying to get to the point?
well, because I think God is a God of truth, so God does not lie, and so whatever we hear from God is truth, I think.
Is it a lie to like mythos? Okay, the idea of myth in culture. Okay, it's often people often conflate myth with an untruth, right? Well,
Mhm.
myth is a poetic shortcut to give you the points, the idea, the truth behind all of the words and all of the machinations and the mechanism, right? So myth just gives you the truth in a very, very poignant, uh, soul piercing way that gets right to the facts of the matter. And it doesn't, the details of the story, the myth, right? Like, okay, if we believe that thunderstorms are caused by the great bear, lives on the mountain, when it gets really hot and humid, the great bear starts sweating and getting irritated, and he grabs spears and starts throwing them down from the sky, right? So if you're living on the plains 5,000 years ago, that's a perfectly reasonable story. It tells you get inside, don't walk under a tree, you're going to get hit by a spear by the bear, right? It doesn't matter. It still explains lightning. Okay, it's myth.
But the point is that it's not true.
Or myth. It doesn't matter if it's true. Nobody
Yes,
cares.
it does, because if
So
it is not true, then
it only meant
then you're saying that Jesus is telling something that's not true. Now, in the case of a parable, right, that's a little different, because here you're saying, right, that he is telling a story and he has a particular purpose. But in the context in which Jesus, for example, talks about Adam and Eve, he's not telling a parable. He's simply addressing a question about marriage, I think it was in that particular instance. And that's something that I think is fundamental as well, that the creation has a number of important things that stem right from that. So one of those, for example, would be the idea of the 7-day work week. Also, the idea of marriage would stem from that. And I think that those are both rather important structures for society that do have an actual basis.
not so much anymore, but
Well, that's true enough.
uh,
So I'd be interested in kind of hearing a little bit about how you, as an atheist, kind of come up with a moral standard. This might be a little off topic, but
oh, okay. So basically, answers in atheism, right, is what I named the channel, and it was sort of
mhm,
facetious at the time, but it's more
yeah.
serious than that. It should have been called answers in naturalism, right? So I understand what I am. I'm an organism, okay, a little tiny blob of goo on a little speck of dust floating around in a magnificent universe, an astronomical universe, right? So number one, a little humility with that, right, as to what I am. Okay, but what I am is a human being, a human organism, and
Mhm.
within that human organism, I have a strong, powerful, ingrained morality, right? That is how we operate, right?
Why?
And why?
Mhm.
It's how I evolved. It's how I developed. I developed with a strong sense of caring about other human beings. Most of that comes from a strong, basically a physiological mechanism to make us care about our young, right?
Mhm.
So we care about the young, the small, the fragile, the struggling, right? So we care about the struggle, and however it came to be, Okay, and the other thing is love is sort of tangled up with this whole reproduction bit, right?
Hmm.
But it's tangled up in kind of a wonderful way. So that I believe that most men think they want sex or lust or whatever when what they really want is romance because we are programmed to bond together as male and female or
Hmm.
whatever. These, it doesn't matter. I mean, they're
Well, I think it does if you're looking for reproduction.
well, it's not, yeah, but if you need reproduction, right? We certainly don't need any more of that shit today. We're done. Okay, we're done we're done being fruitful. I don't know if you know that or not, but we're done. But anyway, so all of this comes together as a whole in what I am. It's my very nature. Okay, it's my nature. So the snake has a nature, to strike out and bite you with its fangs. I have a similar nature, and that nature is morality. And I know what's right and wrong. We all know what's right. Like my mommy used to.
But how do you know that somebody else doesn't have different standards than you do? Maybe they just evolved differently, so they have a different mental outlook.
Who do?
You're imposing your moral outlook on others then, aren't you?
No, no, it's not
You
a
are?
moral. Well, okay, the idea when it goes to moral outlook, you've already taken it into that reasoning brain, and that was the point that went wrong when Adam and Eve basically ate from the tree of knowledge, right? That was that reasoning brain that popped up that says, "Oh, I'm going to rationally come to an idea about morality," right? Now, we have to do that for the gray areas between us. Okay, we have to reason, like Roe v. Wade is a good example of something that polarizes, right? That splits
Hmm.
us apart. But you and I know, I mean, we're not killing each other here. We're not warring. We care about each other. We're human beings. If we met at Walmart, I would not have to worry, unless you were, the fringe nutcake, that you were going to hurt me, right? I would come up behind you and I would not say, "Oh my God, this creature might kill me at any moment." No, we don't do that at Walmart. We all know, no matter what our race, no matter where we are on the earth, basically, we can pretty much trust, we're not going to get killed. Well, there are a few tribes that do kill everybody,
Yeah.
but there's, xenophobia is kind of built into the equation too, and there's a lot of evil built into us too, as far as like we would kill for our children, right?
So, and by evil, you just mean things that you basically don't like that you think hurt your young, and that's basically what you mean?
No, not just things that are unpalatable to us, right? Like if somebody gets into if you put families together at a picnic with children, invariably the adults are going to start fighting with each other because the children are going to run at each other's boundaries, right? And that's just unpalatable, and that runs counter to our sense of peace and justice, right? That all of a sudden people are screaming at each other and fighting or fist fighting or whatever over some simple little thing, it just runs away. I mean, morality is not something that is going to decide deterministically what everybody should do at every point in time. There's always going to be a struggle. But for the most part, we all know that we don't want to kill each other. We all know that we don't want to get into a fight. Part of not getting into a fight is our adrenal system makes us feel bad, and we avoid anything other than peaceful paths. So I mean, this is all built in, and I don't find that to be
And
a
no, I think it's fascinating, right? That this is built into us because, right, the Bible says that the law of God is written on our hearts, right? And it talks about the conscience, right? And I think there is good evidence, right, that humans do have a conscience. And part of that could even be simply physical, right? How our body could punish us in certain ways for behavior which isn't proper. So, kind
yeah.
of from a most general perspective, is kind of your view of morality that if something is good for basically the species, then it is moral?
I don't care for the survival of the fittest bullshit.
Okay.
So no, it's not that.
Okay.
What's good for the species is for the species to uh, be well, I hate to say behave as it was designed to behave, right? We're not going to say that, but to be what you are, to be what you are as fully as you are. When a flower blooms, okay, the flower is being the flower as as it unfolds. So we are being our moral selves in our lives, and we are like the blooming of a flower. We become a certain thing, and it's not by design. It's not by mandate. It's not by order. It's not by determinism. It's a stochastic general pattern that you will end up with this blooming of our lives, and we will go through our lives in a certain way, as all humans do, and we all have that in common.
So you would say basically just a natural outgrowth of biology, basically.
Biology and geology and physics and everything else. It's just that we are what we are. We are what we are. We should endeavor to be to follow that groove. I'm a Buddhist, by the way, secular Buddhist.
But why exactly should we follow that groove?
You can run off the groove, but you know what happens when a bobsledder runs off the track? He breaks his head. And if you want to break your head all your life, go for it. Other people are going to get mad at you, and they're going to, they're going to beat you up, and they're going to put you in prison. And it's like, there's no great mandate. It's just like, God, how do you want to live your life? Do you want to be that flower and bloom, or do you want to buck the whole thing and try to become some distorted?
About bucking something and then following the groove, but that implies that there's almost some sort of kind of standard here that we're trying to live up to, when from your position that can't really be true. There is no actual standard. It's just something that we basically come up with.
There is a standard, and we have this reasoning ability, and this reasoning ability can lead us down a lot of wrong avenues, right? Mm-hmm. And then throughout life, this relates to alcoholism and drug addiction. And basically, I made a decision to turn my life and my will over to God as I understand Him, basically, right?
Really?
Okay. So it's I made a decision to turn my life and my will over to this blooming, this groove, right? And not buck it anymore. And as a result of that, I experienced a spiritual awakening that allowed me to overcome a very serious psychophysiological problem called addiction. Okay.
And I believe that's great. But my question here is, why exactly is that good for you that you came out of that?
Why is it good for me?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm happy. I feel better because people are happy, because happy is being generated in waves around me, in my family, and my friends. And it didn't used to be that way. I was, they were wrinkle browed. What are we going to do about Mike? What are we going to do about Mike? Over and over again. And none of that's happening anymore for the last 15 years. Okay.
So basically that's a good thing morally because it made people happy.
Well, what you're asking is if a rock rolls down a hill, why did the rock roll in the good direction? Why did it feel like it had to roll in the good direction? It's not a good direction or a bad direction. It's a direction that the rock is going to roll. Okay. So I roll in it.
But you didn't have to make that choice, right? I mean, you could have stayed addicted, right? But you're saying the reason why it was better that you left that behind, which I agree with, it's totally better that you left that behind. But the reason you're saying why it was better is because it made people happy, right? Including yourself.
Yeah.
So then basically, right, the morality is determinative of whether or not people are happy.
Yeah. Right? I used to walk through the forest in northern Minnesota when I was hunting. And I worked very hard to walk through the forest so that I would not disturb a single branch, so that I would bend and flow around the branches and pick the path of least resistance, so that not even one branch would be moved. So there wouldn't be a single twig moved, right? And I got used to walking that way, and it was just the most wonderful thing for me. And it was more than, oh, that's the right thing to do. Okay, that would be a rational, oh, that would be a weird way to rationalize what I was doing. What I was doing was walking with least resistance through the woods. I was making the least impact. I was very, very smoothly evolving through the woods. And that I think is just a wonderful thing to do. And okay, not all people have to follow that path or do that, but if they don't, if they aberrate, if they go off the path and they start cutting the forest down, the rest of us are going to get together and we're going to screw them up. We're going to give them a bad time. And it's like, what do you want to do with your life? It's not that complicated. It's not mandated.
So what do you think makes it correct, though, to screw those people because they destroyed your forest?
Makes it correct? I wouldn't put it that way. It's like, there's no, like when people want to,
no, I mean, like, why should you value the forest over those people?
Okay. I had a situation in my life where somebody was murdered, okay, recently.
Sorry to hear that.
Somebody very, very close to me, right? The person that murdered her was a very sick individual. And there is the option to resent that person, to hate that person, say, oh, that person was doing evil and doing bad things and all that stuff. And there's another way to look at all of this. It was a thing that happened in my life, in her life, in his life. And had he not committed suicide, we would have had to take him and put him in a box somewhere, right, and contain him, because he was a kind of aberrant individual that would have gone out and done it again, that sort of thing. Now, do I have to look at that and say, oh, I'm glad that son of a bitch killed himself because he deserved it? I don't need to do that. I can look at this as rocks rolling down hills, bumping into other rocks. That's what happened. This is life. I accept God's will. Okay? It's God's will. There's
in what sense is it God's will?
There's the groove. That's what God's will is defined as. Hang on a second. I got a cat in the way.
All right.
Damn cat. He keeps laying on my mouse. I love you, Loki, but not now. I don't love you much right now. There's a step in 12-step programs sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him. Now, here's the important part. Praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Okay? And that's pretty simple. And that's the groove. That is the groove, is that acceptance of life on life's terms, the acceptance of the unfolding of the flower, and endeavoring to not get in the way of any of that stuff. I mean, that is where we use our will and our reason to get back on track.
So who do you believe God is, then, from your perspective?
Well, my sponsor asked me when I told him that I pray, because he is also an atheist, right? He says, who do you pray to? And I said, I don't pray to. I pray. Period. Full stop. I don't have to rationalize something or believe in some critter somewhere that I'm praying to, or try to visualize or encompass what the nature of this thing is. For me, God is the universe. God is the unfolding of the universe. Basically.
So why pray then? Because the universe can't really hear you, can it?
When I pray, it works. Okay, when I pray in that simple way for acceptance of the will of the universe unfolding as it should, okay, something changes in me, and I get answers to my prayers. In terms of, 3 days later, I'll walk around, I'll run into something, and I'll say, oh, that problem I had 3 days ago, now I see it from a different perspective. Now I get it. Okay? That's what prayer does for you. It opens you up to the universe unfolding as it should.
Well, I would agree that prayer can be answered, but obviously I pray to God
yeah.
of the
Do you,
Bible.
do you
But
pray for people like, oh, okay, I've got kidney cancer, right? Or at least I had it. We think we took it out. But like, would you pray for my kidney cancer to be relieved?
absolutely.
Why? What good is that going to do?
I would pray for you because I believe that God has set forth a plan of history that he is going to fulfill, but he also listens to the prayers of the saints. And so I believe that when God hears our prayer, he does listen to it and he will heed it. Now, I don't think that praying for you will necessarily heal whatever affliction you have, because
You're not gonna
sometimes
change
God's
mind.
will is not to heal.
Yeah, you're not going to change God's mind. I mean, God already, he's got this shit. He's got this, right? He's already got this figured out,
See,
right?
but I think God has also ordained us to pray. So he's ordained history, but he's also ordained our prayers in such a way that our prayers show our devotion to God, but he also listens to our prayers, having already ordained them and the result.
See that part, praying only for his will for us and the power to carry that out precludes praying for my kidney cancer to go away. Okay.
I don't think it does, because I think you are praying that if it would be God's will to take away your cancer, that he would do that. So you're not necessarily, I don't think, precluding that.
Why would God care what I like? Okay, if six people prayed for me,
Hmm.
it's this isn't a vote. This is not a democracy. Cancer is not a democracy. Basically, it's going to unfold as it unfolds. And if it kills me, okay, there's nothing you can do about it by asking God. You're not going to change God's mind. That is the
No, but it
will.
could be that he has ordained that it will not kill you, right? And it could be that perhaps he is listening to our prayers and he decided to use medical means to take away the cancer from you.
Right. So, but you see, the problem is that if you have a friend who's dying of cancer and you pray every day, every day, every day that this friend is going to be, saved, right? I'm going to pray that my child hadn't been murdered, right? Every day, and you've set yourself up for being like God or having some effect other than what you can actually have on the universe.
See, but it's
You're
not us who are causing the effect. It's God who is causing the effect.
right. Okay. And you're trying to get in the way of that. So you're not accepting God's will. You are willing on your own. You're using your own will to say, okay, I'm going to design this.
Well,
The
that's
only
why, of course, I think it is important to ask that that God would, well, in the Bible, right, when people pray, there are places, I can't remember exactly where, right, that they ask that, oh, well, in the Lord's Prayer, of course, thy will be done, right? So prayer, as modeled by Jesus, is accepting the will of the Father. And yeah, so it's not going against the will of
so
God.
so what I pray for is acceptance. I don't pray for something to happen in the universe. I pray for acceptance of whatever happens, right? Pray for complete because I find that puts me back in the groove. And
What do you
in
mean
the
by acceptance? Simply that you would find that comfortable,
yeah,
that you would find comfort in that?
comfort, I wouldn't describe what I'm going through as comfort over what
Sure.
happened to me. Okay. Uh, Basically, I accept it. I'm not out there screaming, hating, screaming for justice, looking for blood. I'm not any of that. I mean, as a result of it, I would like to make some changes in our laws, right? So I will make an effort, but eh, anytime that effort becomes me pulling everything into what my way, what I think should happen, that sort of thing, then I start to get into a tight little ball, and then I start to suffer as an individual. I don't want to suffer. I want to follow the easy way. I mean, it's
Now, the
really
reason why I said comfort is because I believe that we are given comfort by God through our trials, and that he is basically our comfort. So whether we will live or die, basically we can find comfort in God is why I would say
Yeah,
that.
and that's and okay. So what you're talking about is spirituality, and spirituality is sort of a laying down of all noise and crazy skittering around, and tightly focused hatred, and all of that. Just relax, just fall down and accept it. Let it flow through you. Let
So what
the
I'm struggling to understand here is, okay, so I pray and I have a belief, right, where there is a mechanism, right, through which my prayers are answered. But
right.
you pray to the universe. So how do you believe that your prayers are consequential in any way?
If I want to talk about a mechanism, I understand a lot about neuroscience, and I understand that basically when I pray, my brain gets into a slightly different state that it is in when I'm focused on something, when I'm concentrating on something. I'm now basically opening up to everything else and settling down my mind. So at the same time that my mind is becoming completely active and diffuse. Okay. So I mean, I have my mechanisms too, right? I can come up with my mechanisms, but I don't
So in a
need them.
sense, you're basically, it's prayer is basically a way of clearing your mind for you, basically, so that your mind can be applied to
It's a,
other
it's a skill.
topics.
It's basically a skill that you can develop, and a lot of people don't know this. Okay, my teens, I suffered what could only be called mental illness. Right, I was, medicated. I was in hospitals. I was being seen by professionals and all of that stuff. And at some point in my life, all of that was very simply solved by giving up and following the groove and settling down. Okay, and so by this mechanism of prayer and spirituality and meditation, basically all of that was taken away, just like that. I was fighting the system to the point where it almost killed me. Okay, and a lot of us do that in our lives, and you don't have to do that. You have the power. You can learn the skill of giving over, of giving your will over, that part of your will that is problematic anyway. I use the part of my will that, I pick up the cup and have a drink of coffee. That part's okay.
So why exactly, okay, you say, okay, this part of your will is problematic, right? Because it does not follow this rut, right? The rut
Yeah.
of whatever we want to call it, human nature or whatever. But okay, so we could say, rationalizing this, well, the reason why we want to follow that rut, the reason why that is moral is because that is best for the individual, that is best for the community. Like, why is that? Why is following the rut the good thing to do?
Well, as it turns out, from what I've observed, it's best for both, and that's a win right there.
So then
Uh,
could we really develop a moral system, right, from your position and say, well, whatever is best for the community is really then whatever is best for the individual and the community and the species is what is moral.
you see, we're never going to come up with the perfect solution to all of that. It's always going to be an ongoing negotiation, right? Okay, but we need to negotiate with less.
Negotiation between what?
All of us together. You're talking about coming up with a moral objective for the entire human race, right? Okay, we're quite a ways away from that, but it's a grand goal. It's something we should do, but it's going to be done a lot easier.
Why is
If,
it something that we should do?
why should we do that? Why shouldn't we? Okay,
Well,
choice between if you have a choice between going to war and not going to war, what are you going to pick? And why are you going to pick that?
I mean, it kind of depends on the circumstances, I feel like.
Well, if you're going to go to war, you got to get up, you got to do push-ups, you got to load the gun, you got to like carry a big backpack around. Why do any of that? Why not just go relax in the garden, right? I
I
mean,
mean, I
you
think there's certain situations in which both would be appropriate. But I guess you are trying to say that, right, if you're trying to argue, right, that we should just always be peaceable.
Yeah.
Because and I would be fine with that too, but the problem is obviously there's certain situations in which you can't be peaceable because you're being attacked.
Oh, you have to occasionally do that, and when those situations occur, we have all of the biology and the natural ability to meet those problems. When an emergency happens, I mean, like if a car accident happens on the freeway, you'll see people pulling their cars over and running out to help the person, right? And they're not thinking, they're not rationalizing, they're not saying, oh, this is what I should do. I read this, or I thought this, or I reasoned this. They just do it. They just do it.
So your kind of view of morality could kind of be summed up as we should try to follow basically our human instinct for what is good and basically follow the rut of human nature.
Yeah.
Wherever it leads.
We'll be fine if we can find that groove. There's a lot of noise, so a lot of people.
So what if people disagree on what human nature, what is good? I mean, what happens when there's disagreement on that? Do you just have majority vote or what?
Yep, you're going to have to do it that way. Or
so
you could
basically, if the majority decides that the minority should be dead, then that's just moral.
Well, I must admit that I wanted to take all of you creationists, put you in a spaceship, and shoot you off to another planet. Okay, no, and I'm not above that, but I think
not kill us, just to another planet.
Shoot you off. Just just go find your own. That's all. Okay, so I go through.
We're the ones who believe that the Earth is finely tuned to fit life.
So. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. God, that's a problem. I guess we're gonna have to leave, right?
Yeah.
You guys have your fine-tuned Earth or whatever, but it's it isn't that complicated. It's like I have a strong faith that all of us at our core know right and wrong innately. And if we can get down and get rid of the noise and get rid of the rationality and the bullshit, that we will all come, to pretty much to this path, except for a few outliers. And it's never going to be perfect, never going to be paradise. We left the Garden of Eden a long time.
Right. So how exactly do we kind of get there from, okay, so majority rule does in some sense decide morality, but then also I think you're going to agree that sometimes majority rule can be wrong about morality.
Yeah, like what's going on today, basically. Well, it's not even the majority, is it? Majority of the Supreme Court, anyway. I really disagree with all that, but anyway.
So why do you disagree with that? Because in my view, the continuation of the human species is dependent upon offspring, and so really, isn't that the good thing that people should be embracing the rut of biology?
Well, no. That's an idea about how many of us there should be. Okay, there's nothing about biology that says there has to be a certain quantity of human beings, or there
isn't. But the point is that once pregnancy has happened, right, there is something about following the rut of biology, right? If we're talking about not trampling sticks in the forest, right, there is something even deeper and more meaningful about not killing members of our own species that are vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that if you've ever been through or ever been faced with the choice of an abortion, right? Okay, this is one of those things where you're right there in the gray area, right? In the gray zone.
Why is it the gray zone?
Well, between between what's happening to your wife, to your woman, the woman that you got pregnant, and what's happening to you emotionally, our projection and attachment to a possible child that could be or could have been, that sort of thing.
I mean, it is already a child because you have to get rid of it, so it is already existing. It is
not what I would call a child. A child is something I can rock in my arms, basically. I'm all for abortion up to 1 year of age. So I don't think
up to 1 year of age.
Oh yeah. I'm taking the radical other opposite view from you, and maybe we can meet in the middle. I'd like to meet at around 12 weeks if you don't mind. But
well, I think 1 year. You're basically just supporting infanticide, then, right?
Well, yeah,
But to
but I'm
me, I feel like that is contradictory to the whole moral system you've laid out so far about embracing the rut of human biology, right? I feel like that is part of human biology, as you were talking about the maternal instinct and also paternal to care for the offspring. And you're talking about how we need to follow that, and that's why we don't murder people, for example, or do things that would get us cast out of the group. But then at the same time, you're like, well, we could kill children, right? I mean, like, that doesn't that seem a little problematic or inconsistent?
well, if you actually kill, okay, if you realize I'm being a little facetious with the 1 year, and I'm just sort of what I'm doing is I'm coming at you. If I'm going to sell you a car, right? It's like, oh, I want $50,000, and what are you going to offer?
Yeah,
You
but
know,
my
we,
point is, I don't care
I'm going to
whether the
sell you
child
the
has been
casket.
born yet or not. I think it has value either way.
I'm going to
So
sell you
for
the casket.
me, killing a child that is 1 year old is no worse than killing a child that is still in the womb.
Yeah, I know, and that's and that is a result of what you imagine a child to be, right? And I have something that I imagine a
I mean,
child to
it's
be.
kind of like biology, though, that is a separate
Now,
organism that has a separate genetic code that is independent of the mother, so much so that the mother actually has to have in her bloodstream, she has to have chemicals, right, that prevent her antibodies from going and attacking the child because it is a different organism with a different
right.
genetic code. So
Yeah,
it is a separate individual.
there's actually a little commandeered ERV that basically helps with that invasion of that parasite inside the woman. But it's not. But what you think of as an individual, okay, to me, is very very different than what I think of as an individual.
So when I think of an individual, I'm saying a separate human being that has a separate genetic code that is basically its own organism, right? It
Yeah,
is a
I don't.
different organism. It is a human because it has human DNA, and it is a separate organism from the mother.
Right, and that's no different than a weed out in my garden. Okay, there's no difference at all. I'm not impressed with it being human DNA. I'm not impressed with anything other than it becoming a child. Okay, a baby, a birthed
Mm.
baby, basically.
Why does moving out of the birth control suddenly give it value in your eyes? Birth
Because
canal, I mean.
that is the point where there starts to be an interaction between all of us and this
So the
child.
importance is whether or not somebody is interacting with you. If somebody doesn't interact with you, they have no value in your eyes.
Oh, no, that would be a real misinterpretation of what I just said.
All
Okay.
right, sorry. Can you say that
Yeah.
again then?
Okay. So there are little children and families down the street here, 2 blocks away from me, who I will never see, never meet, never interact with, right? Okay.
So you're saying as long as that person is interacting with other people.
Right. There's a network, there's a connection. Okay. The whole thing, it's like a fungus. Well, the human race is like a fungus. We're all interconnected, right? I don't
So I
care.
mean, like the obvious example here for me to go to would just be to go to somebody who's in a coma. Like, is it all right to just stab them and kill them because they're not interacting? They don't have the ability to interact with other humans?
Yeah. Well, if there's a possibility, I mean, if there's a mind working in there somewhere, if there's a history, if it's a person. But I mean,
But
why
isn't
would
there
you?
also the possibility that the baby in the womb, I mean, there's kind of the same possibility right there. The person in the coma, there's the possibility that they could wake up and interact with people. And there's the same thing that the baby in the womb, almost certainly, if nothing goes wrong, will interact with people.
That's a good argument, right?
So if interaction is what you're after at, then why are you in support of abortion?
Okay, but the person in the coma basically had a life, has a history, has connections all over the place, right? Already, whereas the baby in the womb has nothing, none of that at all. There are no connections. There aren't connected with the mother biologically as a parasite. I'm not impressed by that. Okay.
I mean, there are emotional connections between mothers and
Oh
fathers and their
yeah,
children.
yeah. And that's why abortion is very difficult for people to decide to do. There's a real tendency to not do that, right? and I think that works out.
And
But
I
I
think
mean,
that's following the biological groove of the human species.
well, this biological groove thing, you keep thinking in terms of Darwin, survival of the fittest, what's right for the species, all of that. None of that is right overall. Okay. It's all connected. It all flows together. But let's get back to
All right,
the good
let's get
argument
back.
that you had about comas, right? A person waking up from a coma. Why not kill them? Well,
All
why
right.
kill them?
I don't know. Maybe that's in your benefit somehow.
What would be a benefit to me to kill somebody? I don't really
I
understand.
don't know. Maybe you get an inheritance or something.
Okay.
My point is, I think it is improper to kill that person because they are alive. And my
I
point
do.
is that in the same way, I think that the baby also has the possibility in the future of reaching full sentience and being able to interact in human society. And I think those things can be pretty obviously correlated
Right. And it
or
could,
compared.
could interact in such a way that it gets a rifle, climbs onto a roof, and kills 20 people. I mean, anything could happen, right? But you're imagining, so you're taking on the role of God and imagining a life for this
It's
little
already living, otherwise you wouldn't have to kill it.
ball of goo. It's not alive.
It is biologically alive.
Oh,
Cells
it's
are biologically alive.
a parasite. It's biologically a parasite until it's born, basically.
It's literally not a parasite. The mother's body accommodates it. It is the natural outgrowth of human biology. That is how our species literally survives. It's not a
That's
parasite.
not what my wife said. She had
I guess that trumps
parasites,
that.
two little parasites in her that almost killed her. At the same time, and those parasites are now 41 years old. But I went through an abortion, basically, so I understand the all of these imaginings. In fact, last night, my sons are tech wizards, right? For some reason, they were so busy being building a computer company that they forgot to have offspring, and that bothers me. I would like to have offspring, right? And I'm never going to get grandchildren, right? And so last night I was thinking, oh my God, that aborted child could have had a baby, children, right? And but that's my imagination projecting and taking hold of things. What it comes down to is when a person finds out that they're pregnant, right, with a partner. So you have a family. Imagine a man and a wife, okay,
Mhm.
and they're in a situation, and this pregnancy pops up, okay. They have to make some decisions about the course of their lives, the course of the children they already have. Like there are places in humanity where there have been choices made to kill children or let certain children die
Mhm.
to let others live, right? Those are
Right.
choices that you have to make in
So you
that.
would basically say that they haven't given their consent yet to a baby, right?
Right, right.
Okay, but here's my counterpoint. My counterpoint is if you have a stick of dynamite and you flick a match and you light the dynamite and throw it off somewhere and it happens to kill 3 people,
Yep,
you're guilty.
yep.
Why are you guilty? Well, what if you stood up in court and you said, well, I only consented to lighting the fuse. I did not consent to the dynamite blowing up. Doesn't that seem ridiculous? The same point is in human intercourse, pregnancy is the obvious possibility, and therefore consenting to sex is consenting to pregnancy.
Okay. So you think,
Therefore, you have already consented to the child.
yes, so you think because sex we should be damned.
What do you mean?
Okay, because sex, okay, if you don't want a child and you engage in sex because sex we should be damned. Because we made our bed, we should lay in it, right? Well, a lot of things happen in life that you do not see coming, okay? That
See, but if I am right that this is actually a human life, anything that is coming ahead in life does not justify killing it.
does not justify killing it. There's nothing. You see, we think so differently about what the developing fetus is.
Okay, so for you, when does it become a human life?
Okay, to become a human life.
Mm-hmm.
How did I wrote something last night that we slowly evolve into life, into our lives, right? And we very quickly are taken out of it. You know, within seconds, we will die. But the process of us getting here, okay, has been coming for a long time, and it happens very slowly over the
So you
period.
would say that human life is a process rather than a particular point at which something becomes a human
Somewhere
life.
from fertilization to, 1 or 2 years old, we become viable living creatures, humans, whatever. Okay,
Why does viability determine human life?
Viable meaning that our heart keeps beating and we keep generating, we keep moving forward. That something would have to stop us in order to
Right. What I'm wondering is why exactly do you need to be viable to be considered a human life?
be viable.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, okay, we got to make sure we define viable now. What I mean, viable means that I continue. Okay, that my cycle continues. That the energy comes in, and I continue to live and continue to rebuild myself. That happens that happens for about 70 to 100 years, and then I'm no longer viable. Then I die.
Okay, so that's how you're using it. I was using it in terms of being able to survive basically without dependence on another person.
Oh, that's impossible. We can't
Well, I
do it.
was using it in terms of like biological dependence, such as a fetus, right? Being biologically dependent, not being able to survive without
Oh, okay,
a mother.
viability of the womb, that sort of thing.
That's the sense in which I was using it.
Yeah, the process of going from a zygote to a fully developed human being is a very slow unfolding process. And I
Mm-hmm.
do not see a problem with terminating it somewhere early. And everybody's going to have different feelings about where we can do that. But those feelings and that imagination, it's all in our heads. As Rebecca would say, it's just a story. It's
I watched that.
so, right? Just a story. Yeah. Anyway, we should get back to evolution. This is
Yes,
deep. But
that's good.
this God, the thing is, in this country, Peter, uh, we need to keep the autonomy to our own bodies, to our rights, whatever. We need to stop making decisions for other people that are in that gray area.
See,
We're,
but
we're
you're already assuming that I'm wrong to prove I'm wrong.
assuming that you're wrong to prove you're wrong.
Well, you
No,
said no, because I am saying that is a human life. So this has nothing to do with giving bodily autonomy. If anything, I'm the one defending bodily autonomy if I'm right that that's a life because I'm giving
well, fetus.
autonomy to the fetus, right, so that you can't kill it.
Right, right, right. Interesting, but it's not a life. It's a parasite. It's a
Well,
parasite. Well, you see,
it doesn't fall under the definition of a parasite.
it's a gray area, and I'm going to go back to my position that we should abort up to 1 year of age, up to the first birthday. You know,
Okay, can you kind of resolve this for me? Because I'm struggling to see how exactly this fits with. Okay, so we've talked all about kind of morality and kind of your view of that. How does that fit into this overall picture of following the groove of nature?
okay. So if you're in a position, okay, if you're in a marriage, say, okay, that is falling apart, destructive, you have other children, this pregnancy pops up, okay, there's no child there in its crib, right, to consider. Okay, at that point, there are gray areas. Okay, so now you're in a gray area where life is, where we can't say, okay, if you mix yellow and red paint, no one can say where orange begins. Okay, I don't give a shit who
Sure.
you are. And if you are the person, if you are the couple that's involved in this dynamic in your life, right? That is your private matter. That's something
Hmm.
that you have to decide where orange begins, okay? And what decisions you're going to make for yourself. And of course, there's a point on the spectrum where we can all say, oh my God, that is definitely orange. That's red. That's yellow, right?
Okay,
And we're
but
all,
why isn't it red right from the beginning?
why isn't it? Because you have yellow paint and you're mixing it. Okay.
No, but see, but you're using this analogy, right, that this is not human and it becomes human over time. So why is something that is a separate entity that has human DNA and will definitely develop into a fully formed human if no abnormalities occur, why is that not a human?
How do you know that it's going to develop into a human?
Well, I'm saying if no abnormalities occur, it will develop into a human, right? If it doesn't die, or it will develop into a fully formed human.
But if we've aborted it, it's not going to. So
Precisely.
problem solved.
See, but the point is that that is just as morally wrong as killing somebody who is already a fully formed human.
Because you think you know where orange is better than me.
No, I'm saying the whole thing is orange.
All the way in between. You think orange starts right at the point of red, right? I would disagree.
I mean, I'm not sure I understand completely what you're using to represent orange and red, but
I'm saying that you're in a gray area of morality, right? And you're trying to make a choice for my wife.
see, I don't think it is a gray area of morality.
Supreme Court, right? You think it's not a gray area, but do you happen to know me and my wife in 1990?
No,
92?
I don't. But I think that killing other humans is wrong regardless of the situation.
Well, we killed one, so and it's like, why? What would you have done? You would go back and you would force us to make that decision, even though you didn't know us.
I think that it is wrong to kill other humans.
You do.
And I think that you could phrase this the same way. Let's say you had the opportunity to kill somebody who is in their 40s.
Yep.
And then I stop you from killing that person in their 40s.
Yep.
Is that me forcing you to do that? Yes, I am forcing you to not kill somebody.
Right.
But I think that is a good thing because we are preserving human life.
So you're going out there and you're picking your orange at a point where I'm going to agree with you that yes, that's definitely orange, right?
And my point is,
you're trying to use that as an argument to tell me that I should pick orange at your spot at the beginning, right at the red dot, right?
correct.
I mean,
Yep.
It hasn't even started mixing with the yellow yet. It just got it got fertilized. So I mean, you're just basically trying to impose your will on me.
Well, I mean, you could say that I'm trying to impose my will on you to stop you from killing a 40-year-old, and that would be true as well.
Well, that would be true because we agree with that, right?
But I'm still imposing my will on you. I mean, I don't really care about whether or not what I will gets followed, right? What I'm caring about is that human life is preserved no matter what age it is.
You're picking a 40-year-old, okay? Mm-hmm. Which we all agree, 99.9% of us agree, is a human life, right? And you're using that to try and convince me that it's a human life back here where we disagree. So you're going back to
that. So what has changed between there, right? What has changed between there? The main thing which has changed is that the organism has become fully mature, right? It has developed all of the bodily structures and it now is completely fully mature and viable. That's the difference, right?
That's why I draw the line a little bit later. Okay, it's taken a breath. It started to basically create a conscious construct in its mind so that it can be a conscious human being. Okay, and then to me, okay, that is my child. Okay, so I do not see that little squiggly fish-like thing as a child. Okay, you do. So we differ on that. It's a gradient. It's a gray area. You're trying to impose your gradient on me. You're trying to impose your absolutist thinking on me. So why should you be allowed to do that? When it says decision,
My point is
something
that
that
you are being inconsistent
uh,
because you, of course, agree, thankfully, that people should not be murdered when they're adults. You agree with me on that.
feel
I
that they
mean,
shouldn't be murdered. Yes.
yes.
It,
And my point is that the fetus, which has been fertilized, has its own unique genetic code. It is a separate organism from the mother. It is a
right.
human because it has human DNA. It has the possibility to attain consciousness. It has the possibility to develop into a fully formed human. And
Yeah.
all of those things, I think, make it a human. And thus, that is why I think it is just as wrong to kill a fetus as it is a 40-year-old.
You do, but I don't.
Right.
Okay. So we differ. We differ on that
Mhm.
opinion. So you want a
See,
law.
but I think
You
that's
want to
where you are being inconsistent there, though. That's where I think, because you're being inconsistent with that, I think. Because you're saying some human life is valuable, other human life is not valuable.
okay, because you and I differ on what human life is. So if you understand that, you know that I'm saying that all human life is valuable, okay? Because all human life that I would find that is life, okay, is valuable, and we
So
agree on
basically,
that.
we're going to redefine life so that we can define what is valuable and what is not valuable.
You
I
can't.
mean, to me, that's kind of dehumanizing, right? So let's just define life in a way so that we can just get rid of whatever we don't value.
Okay, why don't we redefine life as a gradient, okay? And you need to understand that just because you have an absolutist idea about that gradient, not everyone does. Everyone else is on the gradient. Okay.
Hmm.
So, okay, are you going to impose your will down to the point where we have this gray area in morality, right? So, gray
See,
areas
but the
in morality,
question is whether or not I am correct, right? Biologically speaking, the question is that a human life or not? Okay?
wait.
Let's say if it were a human life, do you think it would be okay to abort it?
So,
I'm saying
you,
let's assume for a minute. Let's say it is a human life. Does that make it okay to abort it? Because I know there are some people who would say, "Well, this is a human life." Who would agree with me? But they would say it's still okay.
okay, that's just completely wrong-headed in that you're coming up with this phrase, a human life, right? And you're
Hmm.
expecting to find some absolute way to define that, right? That there's like, okay, it's the DNA.
I think there
Okay,
is a specific time at which life starts,
right, you
meaning
do.
that you
You
become your own separate organism when the egg and the sperm meet. That is a new organism. A
okay?
combination of cells from two separate organisms becomes a single new organism, and that same organism is the same organism as you are when you are fully developed.
Even though that organism is only using the mother's DNA.
What do you mean it's only using mother's DNA?
Okay, for the first, I think I'm not sure how many days. It depends on the organism, basically. But for the first part of the zygote's life, it is not using the male's DNA at all. It's using the mother's DNA. Okay, there's mRNA in there. Okay, it's the mother's. The male's DNA hasn't even started to do anything yet, basically. So where are you going to draw the line there? One, from
Well, the fact is
fertilization.
that it's all together inside of a specific organism, whether or not it's functioning or
Oh, it's in a
not.
bag. Okay, so if there are 5 people in a trolley car, then they're an organism.
No, because they're each a separate individual. But
Because they can
that's
swim around. Okay,
what do you mean?
cells and it can wiggle around too. You're trying to apply these absolutes to biology, okay? And I'm trying to get you to see that biology is this network of just unflowering, right? This blooming that
Hmm.
is all interconnected, and you can't put your pencil down on a point and say, "Ah, that's a human being." This is that. What we can do is you and I can agree, okay, on what's a human being. We get a third person in here, and now he may not agree with us, and we get a fourth person. I mean, where we put the pencil down, and what you're trying to say is, oh, it's a human being, and you keep saying that over and over again. To me, that's kind of meaningless. Okay, that I am a human being. It's sort of a God. Why are you putting labels on me? I'm a flower. I identify as a flower.
Well, it's simply because I place more value on human life than on other types of life.
Why?
Because I think that human life is made in the image of God, and therefore it has the capability for rational thought, and also it has the capability to be like God, and therefore it is more valuable than other life.
Not everybody adheres to your Bible.
No, so, I know it. Not everybody agrees to that.
Okay.
Anyway, we can get back to some other subject because I don't think we're going to agree anytime soon here.
Think gradient, think network, think interconnect. You don't
think the natural rut of biology.
You aren't really a self. Get over yourself. Okay. So evolution. So species. One species basically splitting into two different ones. Okay, the split that made dogs and cats, right, going way back. Okay, how do you find against that? What do you find not possible in that particular split?
Sure. So there's two types of ways I could go with this, right? So I could either argue that the transition from this hypothetical ancestor of dogs and cats into both of those groups was not possible, or I could argue that we don't have evidence that happened, right? So those are kind of the two avenues through which I could argue.
No evidence.
I'm not going to say I'm particularly familiar with the whole dog and cat phylogeny and exactly which taxa are there, but I would argue that those would represent different kinds of organisms, and probably I would argue that Felidae and Canidae do represent different kinds. Each of those groups probably did arise from a single kind.
Okay, why?
So I would say that based off of baraminological studies. So this is something I've also talked about for humans, right? So basically, my interest is in doing things like this with humans, right? So what we've done is we've taken like a data set, right, where we have these different morphological features, right, that we can use to distinguish between humans and chimpanzees, and then also Australopithecines, and we see where they all fall in relation to one another. Okay. And basically, the important thing there is that we can observe clusters, right? So it turns out that humans formed their own little cluster, and it turns out that Australopithecines also formed their own cluster that is distinct from that of humans. And so there's been kind of some various responses to that, right, from the evolutionary side, right, which would say things like, well, the fossil record is fragmentary, right? So our prediction is that however many fossils we will find, we won't be able to bridge this gap between what is human and what is non-human, right? Yeah. So evolution would predict that there is this complete succession of organisms, right, where organisms change so little that we shouldn't even be able really to tell, right? The whole tree of life should be a basically perfect gradient. Now, obviously, we don't have a perfect fossil record, right?
Right.
So we have to account for that, right? We have a scatter shot of fossils. But I think it's interesting that even given the scatter shot of fossils that we have, I think we can pretty neatly group organisms into human and non-human, and we can find separation in between those. And I would predict that as we continue to find fossils, we will not fill that gap. And then furthermore, I would say that, basically that would be kind of the type of evidence that I don't think we have proof that this transition happened. whether or not it is capable of happening or not.
Okay. So if it's capable of happening, if it could have happened, right? If there's no molecular biological reason that it couldn't happen, that a cat and a dog couldn't have had some sort of a common being back then, that the common organism that branched into both of those things. Okay. How are you going to prove that didn't happen?
So
Right?
first
With
of all, kind of
fossils?
first of all, kind of to address whether or not there is the possibility that they could not have arisen from a common ancestor given enough time. So I'm not exactly sure for cats and dogs, so I'm going to use an example from humans here. But so I do
Come
data
on.
collection on humans, right? So in Australopithecines and chimpanzees, right? So what we do is we measure the sizes of various bumps on the bone and things like that, right? And that they can play roles in muscle attachments. And as we were talking about earlier, those sorts of things can be changed fairly easily, right? I mean,
Yep.
it doesn't really take a whole lot to grow a new bump on your bone in some place, right? And so basically, I would argue that, there are some bigger kind of structures, for example, in the human chimpanzee kind of thing that make me somewhat doubtful, such as like the presence of like the laryngeal air sacs on the hyoid bone, right? So
Okay.
in chimpanzees and other creatures, they have the hyoid bone that has a bulla. Basically, your hyoid bone is right in here, right? And it has a little extension on the end that's cup shaped. And there's a whole air sac right inside of here called your laryngeal air sac. And the humans which we have don't show that. So like Homo erectus hyoid bones don't show that. But it turns out that the Australopithecines did still actually have that whole laryngeal air sac. So whether or not, that's something that actually could not evolve, I'm not sure. But given that we find these creatures having it and these don't, I'm kind of I don't necessarily find reason to believe that that feature was lost over time.
Okay. Why? Why couldn't it have been?
I'm not saying it couldn't have been, but I'm saying I don't have reason to think that it was, because Australopithecus afarensis had the full thing, and then Homo erectus did not have that. So we just have two character states here, right? So if we continue to find hyoid bones and we find out that we can see this whole transition, well, then I think then you might actually have a point, right? But right now, we only have two character states, right? Having this whole laryngeal air sac or not having it, we don't have like a loss over time.
Okay.
Now, I would say that going beyond that, right? Then, so we have like all these bones, features of the bones, right? And of the soft tissue, but I'm mostly interested in bones, right? That we can study and we can point to this separation between humans and non-humans. And I think that that is evidence that this transition didn't actually occur, because we can find that separation in these vital character states that need to be changed to get from, the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans to the Australopithecines to humans. I don't think that they have been bridged.
Okay. So not finding something is evidence that it didn't occur, is what you
No,
said.
I'm making a prediction. I'm saying in the future, when we find more, we will not bridge the gap, right? So I'm saying this gap is going to remain consistent, and not that that proves creation, but I think it is consistent with what we would predict, that we would find this gap.
What would invalidate your hypothesis?
Observing that new fossils actually do fill that gap.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, something that would. But you have a kind of a long range prediction, and you're depending a whole lot on fossil evidence. So what if we don't do it that way, right? We're looking at genetics and molecular biology and genetics, right? And we can show you the genes that are responsible for creating that phenotype.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have a series of genes that are responsible for the phenotype in the chimpanzee and in the human, right? And we can show you that given our best guess at molecular clocks and the length of the split, we can show you that it's conceivable that mutations could have done this, and that there are and that there are conceivable viable organisms at every step of the way. Okay,
Oh,
we
I don't
showed
doubt
you that.
there's conceivable viable organisms, right? That's kind of falling back into this old idea, right? That like feathered dinosaurs, for example, couldn't fly, and that somehow makes them
Right,
biologically
right.
right. That's kind of a silly
Okay.
idea, right? That biological organisms would not be
Yep.
viable, but yeah.
So basically, if we have that pathway, okay,
Well, the problem is relating in between that pathway and to the character states themselves, right? And that's actually super difficult, right? To actually make any correlation between
it's coming
genetics.
along.
It is coming along. I won't deny that, but I don't think we have the ability to actually point to genetic markers for a lot of the things which distinguish humans from chimpanzees, for example.
We actually do have a lot of things.
So I'm saying skeletally for like a lot of these features of these bones, but yeah.
So, but we do. Okay, so I have. I have no Christianity in my background. No reason to believe in the Bible. No reason to believe in a 6,000-year-old Earth, and I have a perfectly viable, granted not entirely filled in, understanding of how one organism changes to another. Right?
Mm-hmm.
How one bone changes to another. How some feature would appear or disappear or whatever. Why should I accept your hypothesis?
Well, first of all, I think we have to get to the point where both are equally possible, right? And I mean, to begin with, I think that the kind of whole evolutionary idea is flawed from the very beginning. I mean, beginning with abiogenesis and all of that. But to put that aside, because that's not really the purpose of this discussion to talk about that, I think that that is a fulfilled prediction of younger creationism, that we would find a fossil gap between humans and non-humans. I think so. I think that's a fulfilled prediction, which is a point I think in favor of young Earth creationism. And also, I think that young Earth creationism has other predictions, I think, that have the possibility of being fulfilled, such as, right, we can predict basically that all humans should exhibit basically intelligence, right? So you would believe that the human intellect has evolved over time, right? Whereas I believe that Adam and Eve, the very earliest humans, had a mental capacity probably greater than ours today. And so I think that's an interesting prediction, right? That leads to a possibility for our model to be falsified, possibly, but it also leads for possible prediction. I think parts of that are being fulfilled in that we're seeing that Neanderthals practice burial, were very intelligent, as well as other human species, but then also things like Homo naledi possibly practice burial as well. And I think that is also consistent with the idea that all of these different human forms, even though they look quite different from Homo sapiens, were quite capable of exhibiting this intelligent behavior that I would predict that all humans should show. In terms of why exactly you should believe my model, I think that the evolutionary model is, I'm gonna say, somewhat. I don't think it is fully capable of basically producing that transition.
Okay, when you say, okay, which transition are we talking about now? You mentioned a few.
Let's just say
Not the air sac, the
from the common
laryngeal air.
ancestor to humans.
Okay, so you don't think it's capable, but why? Because
So I think that we have a number of kind of biological factors which would indicate that humans have unique features which aren't seen in other creatures. So, for example, we could talk neurologically. Now, obviously some of the very earliest humans had different brain organization than modern humans, but they still had an organization, which I think is fundamentally human-like in some important ways that would have allowed them to have greater intellectual capability than other organisms. And I don't think that eating meat, for example, is a good explanation for how exactly a brain can increase in size and become better organized.
There's a much better there's a much better solution to that, and it's been a while since I've been into neuroscience, but basically there are loop-like circuits into your frontal cortex, right? Okay, and all across your cortex, you've got your somatic band up here that senses, and you got your motor band right behind it that moves your muscles, and right in front of that you have another loop, and that loop basically evolved in all in a lot of animals, particularly vertebrates, right, to be able to premotor control that motor loop based on motor senses, right? So now we have another loop that gives you a great capability to perch on the edge of something, but not move yet, but plan that move, plan that jump, like my cats will plan their jump onto the table. God, it's funny when they fail. They get so disturbed when they fail. But anyway, they fail like 1 out of 100 times, but boy, when they fail, it's funny. So you have this extra loop, right? Now, in between primates and between humans and all other vertebrates, okay, there's a big, huge sac of like fluid at the center of your brain called the fourth ventricle, and they found a swelling from the front of one of these loops that indicates that we have still another loop, humans do. And to develop that other loop embryologically is slam dunk easy to do. Okay. There's billions of details, right, that were worked out by natural selection, but just to get that extra loop, to get another loop, and for some time in the future to get even another one, so we can do even more spectacular number tricks with our brain. So I mean, this is conceivable, and this has been looked at, and that's not that difficult. So if you want to pick intelligence, but when you're talking about humans, we are so biased about what we are. It is much better to talk about the common ancestor of whales and hippopotami, or cats and dogs, because according to your model, that couldn't have happened. So I'd like to know what your evidence is that it couldn't have happened.
So in terms of...
By the way, on whales, we found a whole lot of those intermediate fossils.
And I am open to the possibility that whales could have once walked on their legs.
Okay.
So I'm not going to say I'm not necessarily, I don't have a strong opinion of that, but I'm open to that possibility.
Yeah, so you're down to pretty much the special creation of man. Okay.
No, because I do think that there are different kinds of organisms, and we can detect discontinuity fairly consistently across lots of different groups of organisms. So as we were talking about before, right, they've done studies and looking at the fossil members of like Felidae and Canidae and be able to distinguish between these two groups and finding a gap between them. And I think that a similar thing has been done between, for example, whales and other organisms. That would include walking whales. But I think that this is an important area for creationist research to continue with baraminology, right? So to kind of develop an idea of what organisms are in the same kind and what are not. And because I don't know the specifics of whale anatomy, I'm not going to say that I know of a specific feature which could not have changed, but I'm going to say instead that I don't think we have enough evidence to say that transition happened.
Okay, so by clustering the features of a cat and a dog, you're claiming that we can prove that one couldn't come from the other.
No, I'm not claiming that. What I'm claiming is that we don't have enough fossil evidence to say that they have a common ancestor.
Molecular biologists don't care about fossil evidence. I don't give a
Well,
shit.
you know what? When it comes to molecular evidence, I mean, once again, you know as well as I do that the way in which I'm going to explain that is because humans and apes, or humans are apes.
Cats and dogs.
So we're going to say that cats and dogs, for example, have very similar features, and thus they were created to be similar in a lot of ways. And there are some things that you are going to then bring up, right? So you're going to bring up ERVs, you're going to bring up mutations, you're going to bring up non-functional DNA, right? So I have several ways that I could possibly go with that.
There's one.
So, right, for me then, there's several possibilities right there. I could say that the DNA is functional. I could say that it has lost its function. I think all of that I would need to, obviously focus on specific DNA elements to actually make an argument like that. But that would be where I would go.
Okay. We're over 2 hours, so. But yeah, that might be a second conversation we could have about the. But I think we should focus on cats and dogs, or maybe something else other than humans and everything else, right? Because you already have this special. You're not very humble about what humans are. You think it's like God or something, but
No, we're not God, but we're made in His image. We are the crown of creation. We're made to have dominion over it.
My kitty isn't.
Huh?
Yeah.
No, your kitten isn't made to have dominion over creation.
Loki, did you hear that? Loki's pissed off right now. Okay. You have heard him deeply. So anyway,
before we go, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was wondering if before we wrap up, I could pray for you.
No.
All right then.
Yeah. Well, it depends on what you want. If you want to pray for acceptance, yes. But if you want to pray for something specific, no. And, I decline. I think I let Rebecca do it, but I have a strong religious aversion to praying for. Okay.
All right. I'll pray for you off stream.
Good. I think you can do that. Yeah. So it just goes counter to my particular religion, right? Which is you don't pray for, you pray. Anyway, I'm sorry.
All right.
Anyway,
it was very nice talking with you, Mike. Great to do that.
Yeah. So I'm going to end the recording. Okay. And goodbye, cruel world is what I like to say.